Hey folks, thanks for joining me today for what will be a unique conversation between higher education and industry credentials. I have spent the last couple of weeks working on this. There's a lot to cover. I don't know how long this video will end up being, but let's just get right into it. So, there have been some articles written around the credentialing in terms of the computer industry. This was an insert in the 2015 Chronicle of Higher Education over the credentialing craze. I'll address some points from this insert. And one of the unique things that I'm bringing to the table is Seneca's writings through Letters from a Stoic, letter 88 that Seneca wrote around the liberal education and what I see as some of this credentialing conversation. So let's start there with Seneca and move through some of the other materials. I have put a several links of sources so that you can read letter 88, read about the intentions of Seneca, read Mike Hadlow's article on the credentialing, and just some other resources that I'll sort of cover here. So, what's really going on here when we talk about higher education and credentials? Well, I think we have two interlocular groups. We have group number one, which are those outside of higher education. That includes media, journalists. Seneca is outside higher education, and those enrolled in the credentialing programs and those which offer credentials. So that's group one. Those are one of our interlocutors, and then group two in this discussion are those inside higher education or in the profession, which in this case is the technical profession, in which the credentials actually matter. So these are the groups that are having the discussion. If you're not in one of those groups, you probably don't really care about this. But otherwise, that's really where I'm addressing this conversation. And myself, I am in group number one. I am with Seneca and I am outside of higher education. Although for my career, I work with higher education, specifically in grant writing, and I have trained, about 60 institutions to use our grant writing software. I have visited probably between 25 and 30 campuses physically, been on site every place from University of Florida to Grand Valley State University in Michigan to University of Utah to Notre Dame to many research institutions or those who are wanting to grow their research portfolio. So that's the perspective that I bring as I'm in group one. I don't work in higher education and I do participate in some of the MOOCs and some of the other credentialing that's offered through Data Camp and other services. So I'll get a little bit into that, but those are our groups for the conversation. So why bring Seneca even into this? Well, when we talk about the last 5 years, which is really the span of time which this conversation has unfolded, although I'm going to point out it's gone on much longer than that. But the most of the people talking about it are really talking about that kind of a time frame window. And there has been a lot of excitement around this within that time frame. But I really wanted to blow out the range by which we were having this conversation. So I'm going all the way back to 64, 65 AD, in which Seneca is writing about what it means to be liberally educated. And we'll get into that. So I'm trying to create a much larger arc by which we can have this conversation around credentials, higher education, and what does that mean for us now and for the future. So let's get into some of Seneca's points and positions. The letter 88 is, you can find it down below. I'm using a different translation for what I put for the quotes. It was written in a Latin and it's been translated a few times. I like that connection of Latin being what it was written in, and Latin for the university, which is Latin for the whole. So that is very much a part of what Seneca talks to, is this element of the whole. So let's get into that. The letters that Seneca wrote are moral letters of instruction to his friend Lucilius, who was a Roman knight. You can Google Roman knights and sort of what their roles were. There's a lot of information on that. But the fact is, this was a man prominent in the civil service who attained his position by sheer industry. Seneca is trying to convince him of trying to win him over to Stoicism. Now, as I mentioned, Seneca did not participate in the educational system, and as you'll read through in this letter, Didymus is criticized for authoring 4,000 books and really writing superfluous knowledge. Didymus was a scholar, and at the time, so Seneca's critical of this scholarship, this excessive writing of rather superfluous knowledge. The way that these letters are written and the way this one is written, this is not a formal logical argument, but in fact, more suggestions based upon observations and experience. They're intended to be something that cultivates your mind so that you can get the values of Stoicism and think about what it is that you'd like to pursue. And I went through also listening to Martha Nussbaum, who's a philosopher, has a great, she wrote a book about the Stoics and talks about Seneca and has a little podcast, 30-minute show about Seneca. And so if you're really interested in what other philosophers have said, you can go ahead and listen to her. But one of the things I took away from that is the idea of Seneca and the Stoics wanting to live in harmony and acting in accordance with nature, which really comes down to avoiding vice. And vice can be anything from avarice to the luxuries of our tastes, and there are many examples of vice that Seneca wants us to avoid. So, as you'll see, this letter opens strongly with Seneca's thoughts on what I think he would say on credentials and things in general. And he says, "You want to know my attitudes towards liberal studies? Well, I have no respect whatsoever if its ends is the making of money. Such studies are unworthy ones. They involve putting out of skills to hire and are only of value insofar as they may develop the mind without occupying it for long. So talents put forth towards the service of making money or the service of our pleasures, these are not things respected by Seneca." And I think he would say that around these credentialing systems, that these are in fact designed to create this portfolio that we can sell and put out our skills to an industry. He mentions that there is only one liberal study, the pursuit of wisdom, and that is to lead a person to being free. And what he means by that is the freedom in your character, not the freedom of external things, but the freedom of internal things. So this is not, liberal studies are not the freedom to travel and have a driver's license and own a car and the freedom to do what you want, travel around. These are external freedoms. That's not what he's talking about. He's talking about wisdom and the internal freedom that brings a person. And this is freedom from the vices, freedom from being a servant of your anger and other emotions. Seneca really goes into that the all the scholars in that are teaching people anything should be intentionally teaching philosophy. He mentions that if you're not intentionally teaching it, you won't even impart it accidentally. And so teach it, teach philosophy with intentionality. And I've raised some questions, is this even the right question? Should scholars in a certain field or those in the education area be even teaching things, philosophies, with whatever their context is? And if higher education is even equipped to do this today. So, whether or not we can agree on those points, I think we would all agree that educators today should not be teaching superfluous knowledge. That is just things that are incredibly temporary or that don't really matter all that much. That's not the kind of things that ought to be taught at the university level. Seneca has a sort of a main point that all educations, professions, and skills do make important contributions, especially to the lives of others. But one of the questions is, does that skill, does that credential, does that degree make an important contribution to your character? And that is, I think, a very deep issue. And so he talks about some character attributes like loyalty, bravery, self-sufficiency, and he says this quote: "Take loyalty, the most sacred quality that can be found in a human breast, never corrupted by a bribe, never driven to betray by any form of compulsion, crying, 'Beat me, burn me, put me to death. I shall not talk. The more the torture probes my secrets, the deeper I'll hide them.' Can liberal studies create that kind of spirit?" I mean, that's a pretty high bar. I don't know if many studies at all can create that kind of spirit. That may have to be something that a person just learns throughout the course of their life. But it is an interesting question to look at these kinds of values and virtues of loyalty and bravery and self-control, and really think about, can these be taught through a liberal education? So he does put forward one formal logical argument. I won't really delve into that. You can read that bullet point, but I'll go with sort of what I thought the concluding point is. Actually, before I get to that, I do want to read something else, which is, so he writes, quote, "Can we possibly look on this as a liberal accomplishment for the youth of Rome, who our ancestors trained to stand up straight, throw a javelin, to toss a caber, and manage a horse, and handle weapons? They never used to teach their children anything which could be learned in a reclining posture. That kind of training, nevertheless, doesn't teach or foster moral values any more than the other. What's the use, after all, of mastering a horse and controlling him with the reins at a full gallop if you're carried away yourself by total, unbridled emotions? What's the use of overcoming opponent after opponent in the wrestling or boxing rings if you can be overcome by your temper?" And I think about Mike Tyson in that case. I mean, he was his own worst enemy outside of the ring, although a great boxer. So that is really the Greek ideals, though. That whole idea of being this well rounded individual who could toss a javelin, sail a boat, work on construction, and then also live the life of the intellectual mind. That sort of whole approach to life is very much a Greek and Roman ideal that, of course, pervades what is being talked about here. And this carries forward into the university of today, in which that sort of creating the well rounded individual as part of their degree program as part of their graduation from the university. That's really one of the efforts that is trying to be accomplished. And this credentialing has raised all kinds of questions around that, whether these skills are continually valued, whether the industry simply wants skills and we don't really care about whether you're that much of a critical thinker anymore, whether you're open-minded, or whether you have a respect for the humanities, whether you've read Shakespeare. We don't really care about that anymore. We need you to program in JavaScript, and so you better have the skills to write Java code, and that's what we need. So Seneca's main point is that we ought be content with being a good person instead of being a learned person, and that this can actually be known. We can actually be a good people, and that is the real goal that we're after, which is this sense of internal freedom that's brought about through this practice. So, pretty go ahead and, I mean, I definitely recommend reading this letter and thinking that, wow, this was written in between 64 and 65 AD, yet it has so many things that are relevant to this discussion. So let's look at what's being discussed. And Mike Hadlow has written an article around the narrative of this skills shortage, and you can go ahead and read that, but I'm going to condense what I think are his three key points here. And I really try to be fair and charitable when I do this. So there is this narrative that there's a skills shortage in technology, and that anyone is able to help us fill this skills shortage gap. And this isn't reality. Okay, it's not realistic that we continue this narrative that anyone can come in, because this is actually programming and working in technology is actually a very high aptitude skill that takes even a long time to be proficient in. It's not like you can even reach a level of proficiency in a short amount of time. And I have another article down below that talks about somebody who wanted to be considered a senior developer in 3 years, and why this really bothered the person. That one of the parts about technology is that you do have to kind of be tempered in your own fire of failure. And this is what makes for somebody who is well practiced in the field. It's not doing everything right and getting these certificates. It's actually when you launch a product that's unsuccessful, or you didn't properly QA test something for the customer and it screws everything up for them. I mean, these are hard lessons that one must learn, but they make a person who works in technology stronger. And so this to even get to this level of proficiency, one must pass through this fire of failures, and become tempered and strengthened through the things that they haven't been able to do well. I think that's one of his key points. Second one is these credentials are harbingers of political leverage and closed-mindedness. That this becomes, well, I have this certificate and you don't. And that's the political leverage. The closed-mindedness is, I have attained this certificate by learning to do things the right way. And in technology, there are many right ways to do things. Now, there are some wrong ways, but there are actually quite a lot of right ways to do things. And when people first receive these kinds of credentials, and they go back to, well, this is the way that this has been certified to proceed, and so we must follow these steps because this is how I've been trained. Well, that's a very closed-minded approach to problem solving, and we need people who are definitely more creative than that. I put this in parentheses because I think this should be part of the conversation, that there's an imagery to these credentials that I think people are also reacting to. Let me give you two examples. So, I have a Six Sigma Green Belt certification from Portland State University. This actually is a higher education institution offering additional credentials to adults who enroll in these courses. And the image of how this looks is very much like, I'm sure, the degrees that are offered. It has the school's name, it has a very nice border, it has a golden stamped seal of the university, and there's an imagery to this. The same with some of the credentials that I've received from Data Camp, which also mirror what it looks like a higher education institution would offer. It has a very nice border, it has my name, it has what's been completed, it has links and references to various pieces of information. So I think the imagery of how these things look is also part of this political leverage and closed mindedness, and I have something you don't sort of portion of the conversation around why there's somewhat a negative reaction to this. And that ties in with the third point, which is that oftentimes these credentialing systems provide gates that anyone with the right amount of resources can really swing open. And I take the example of the Six Sigma Green Belt that I was just speaking of, where it is expensive to get it, and part of the part of what I guess bothers me about it is that there actually is no formal body of certification for Six Sigma. There are many institutions and many programs that a person can go through to receive a yellow belt, a green belt, a black belt, or a master black belt. But there's really no single source of who controls what this credential really means. Now, I picked this program specifically because it was one of the longest programs that I could actually find. I probably could have gotten the same credential from somewhere else in a much shorter amount of time, and that would also presumably mean that the material itself is much shorter. So there's some, and this is more of a personal interest thing for me of, well, I want the most that I can get because I'm going to be doing this for some time. I'm really trying to be honest in my abilities to learn these things. And it's the same way I approach the other credentials, either through MOOCs or Data Camp, is, I take a lot of long notes, very similar to how I've put this together, and really try to learn something at the end of the day that I can carry forward. Not everyone's going to do that. And it may simply be that having a butt in the seat, I mean, do we give that person a pass or not? I mean, this gets into one of the real sticking points with consumer driven credentialing and degree programs is you paid for something, but should we give it to you just because you paid for it? So I think I totally agree with Mike on these 3 points. I think these are great points and real deep issues we need to talk about. I do have some counterpoints to what he has discussed, and that is, so software development, IT, okay, this is not the only profession that has been giving away its knowledge and letting people come into the industry to get credentials. There's a link I have below of someone who's actually gotten their bachelor's in philosophy through the MOOC programs offered. And there are many other courses now being made available in the medical field, sales, data science, different industries are having these kinds of credentialing programs become available. So it's not just software. When I graduated high school in 1999 and soon got my first job in the computer industry in 2000, and I was going to uh, get my associates in computer networking software, there was much discussion at that time of the credentials of, well, don't go to college, go get an MCSE, go get Microsoft certified, because the industry in technology really isn't hiring people who have technology degrees. You can get a just as good of a job right now by not going to college and pursuing different certifications. In fact, many of the people I knew at the time who were working at different internet service providers and maintaining things in the network operations center, the mail servers, we would sit around and work in Linux and do different system administration things. They never went to college, and yet here they're administering how your email is going to be delivered to you. So there was a lot of discussion of, you need to have the skills. You don't need to have the piece of paper that proves that you have formal training in computer science or some kind of technology field. You can actually get a high paying job in the tech field by just doing it, and then get in and just do it. So that's been around for some time. This is not a very new thing around, especially in tech, when it comes to credentials and where a person ought to go. Okay, another sort of counterpoint here is, it's not uncommon that when some kind of new technology or new thing becomes offered, that this causes some uneasiness. And you can look at the printing press, you can look at the telephones, fax machines. You can look at things that also took a while to become so embedded as they are today. But this general uneasiness around what it is that we're doing when it comes to technology and its impacts, I mean, really isn't anything new. So how do we sort of look at that and say, yeah, well, when the printing press came out, people were concerned that this is going to put scribes out of business. I mean, it's kind of silly nowadays, but this was actually a legitimate argument as it pertained to the monks. And deeper than that, it was, well, these monks are, we cannot have idle hands at the monastery, because once the monks don't have something to do, I mean, they may go towards vice as well. And so you're not just corrupting their profession, you're corrupting the very souls of who they are by releasing this kind of technology. I mean, these kinds of panics and uneasiness have been around. So let's think about that a little bit when we talk about technology and credentials and so forth. Another counterpoint is, there's some points I think Mike has around social status. And I want to point out that, the social status of programmers really hasn't been all that great until over the last 10 years or so. The geek nerd culture and people self-identifying as geeks, and geek being printed on t-shirts, and what does it mean to be a geek? Okay, well, this has given rise to some social statuses of being able to say, well, I work in technology, I'm a programmer. Yes, okay, I don't want to deny that in 2015 one may receive some social benefits from making such claims. But we also need to remember that, this is my personal opinion, that a lot of this is affect. This is geeks, as we're talking about them and the rise of nerd culture. I mean, these are people learning things that they will never need, that will never be useful. And I put, the Star Wars mythos as part of a huge, I mean, the I don't even know how to describe it, but just the commercial pushing of by of consumption of this material allows you to claim this label. I mean, it's totally ridiculous, but this social status really hasn't been all that high until this has occurred. So let's temper the view a little bit there around saying, well, you get some social benefits out of making this claim. And okay, this is another big one though. Motivated people are going to seek to grow their skills, and it is something which we should recognize some way. And this seems to be really what credentials help us do is, I'm spending my Sunday, I've spent numerous hours working on this and growing my skills and earning some of these credentials. Some recognition um, is quite a nice thing to have because, as is brought up in the Chronicles piece, that having a portfolio that you can sell, I totally agree with that, and I think this is the new challenge for higher education. All right, so enough on Mike's article. Let's switch to some things brought up in this insert, which I read every article of, but my notes below only contain really notes from two pieces. Goldie Blumenstick's credentialing is, what is this called? When a degree is just the beginning. And because I'm putting this in philosophy, there's an Alan de Botton very small piece that he wrote on the anxiety, the age of anxiety, and how credentials help us deal with that. I think that's absolutely true. So, okay, the certifications, badges, credentials, they are challenging this long-held idea that one single academic credential is enough to ensure an employer that students have these abilities. And what are these abilities? And let's look at, well, what is often provided as this credential from the higher education institution? Well, you're talking about 4 or 5 data points typically, which is the campus that offers the degree, the person's name, what program they graduated in. Maybe you get a GPA, maybe you don't. Maybe has a year that they completed this. I mean, there's not a lot of data points on this piece of paper that really tell an employer what the specific skills are. And I think this is where the credential parts help us. So, what are those abilities that a degree sort of connotes? And these are my observations. I'm sure this is up for much debate and discussion, but as I've looked at and helped universities and have followed this field, I look at what are the real tenets that I can say across all academia that a degree should have. Well, critical thinking is definitely top on my list. I mean, if you have a college degree and you don't understand what critical, especially a bachelor's degree, a bachelor's and higher, if you don't understand what and how to think critically, that system has failed you and failed you greatly. So that's across the board. I think one of the things that's true is you've got to have that. That's what this piece of paper actually tells an employer about you. The other thing is a lot of colleges are the idea of having an opened mind, not so open your brains fall out, but removing your arrogance. Okay, that's what I mean by open-mindedness, is that you really understand that you don't know everything, that there's so much to know nowadays, and this this is the opposite of what the credentials are providing, which is sort of that closed-minded, this is the right way to do things and this is the way it's certified. But a degree really should be removing that arrogance, that one should be so open-minded through getting that degree. It's one of the tenets what that degree sort of connotes. The idea of having that humanities background, I mean, that's an important thing, is that you do need to understand we are human beings, and what does that mean culturally? What does that mean globally? We live in an incredibly global world. We live in a world that's very volatile and very fickle about what it wants. And so having that background in the humanities, look, I mean, if you don't understand Iago from Shakespeare's Othello, and that these kinds of psychopaths like Iago is, that they are in the world. I mean, they were in the world when Shakespeare wrote Othello. They're in the world today. People will you'll think that they're giving you good information and advice, but what they're really trying to do is betray you. That is part of that degree. I mean, you have to understand things like that and have this whole range of knowledge, this whole of knowledge. So those are the things that I wrote down. Now, wisdom, I mean, as Seneca's trying to draw our attention to, the thing that makes one free internally is to have wisdom. Well, I mean, I think these are the foundations of wisdom. And so that's part of the degree program. But higher education is now under a lot of industry pressure to give us some skills that we can that are more usable than that. And this is all about balance. I mean, I know I'm saying these things and it's sounding, but this is all about balance. You have to balance these things. And I think that's where we are definitely struggling, why we're having these kinds of conversations, is to figure out how we will balance that now and moving forward. But I will say, having looked at, so I mean, it's a pretty large amount of resumes, that predictably, someone applying for a job, education, where they went to school is one line. It's where they went to school, what they achieved, and when they graduated. All of the other elements of their resume are work related skills, things that they've completed, teams that they've worked on, really not what they did in college. So this is kind of where the disconnect is, I think, incredibly visible. And, you know, there are some things we can do to change that. And that's what this whole piece is really about. And so let me keep going through what I've noted about this. All right, so we don't have the systems in place that sort of provide this visibility for the employer and what the student has accomplished, what the competencies are of the enrollee and the student who have gone through these courses. As an employer and as someone who's looked at resumes, there are no links, there are no ways to see what out of your C++ programming, what were the competencies that what were your strong points? Programming languages, integrated development environments, things in tech that are very large do have different levels in different areas of strengths for the individuals who work on them. And that is really valuable to be able to know around a programming language. I'll just use myself as an example here, but one of the languages that I've been learning is the R statistical programming language. And there are so many libraries for use in R. And is your strength in the creating of visualizations? Is your strength in using Carrot and using some of the libraries that are more data mining, text mining, machine learning, fraud detection? Those kinds of things are available. Or is your strength in building some of the visualizations, doing some of the statistical analysis? Those are also strengths. So it's a programming language that has various strengths of the individual and what they're interested in, and gives them the ability to sort of talk about that. And we need that kind of visibility when we look at industry, from the industry to the applicant. That kind of visibility can be strong. So I did make some notes of my observations of really, well, what does higher education know how to do, and what doesn't it know how to do? And I've been talking sort of about one of the points, what it doesn't know how to do, which is report these metrics on the individual. It really doesn't know how to kind of provide that. What it does know how to do, and one of the things that it's strong with, and these are some of my own personal metaphors that I've used to really talk about higher education. And one of them is the higher education as a gym. And that is, enrollees pay for access to these facilities, to the best teachers, to the best equipment. But like a gym, that doesn't guarantee you'll ever get fit. And it also doesn't guarantee that you'll have overall health in your life. So it's up to the individual to work on those things. Now, higher education knows how to get you into that gym. Knows how to get you enrolled, provide financial aid, give you a schedule, track your GPA, give you some metrics on how you're doing, mark off whether you've completed these things to a level of adequacy or proficiency, and then provide you a diploma, provide you a transcript. I mean, it knows how to get a person involved in that. Showing those specific competencies and tracking much in terms of postgraduate information as far as where someone has been employed, what they're doing. I mean, it's not very good at those kinds of things, but it does have some strengths. And I like the gym metaphor because there is a real struggle between the consumer capitalist environment in which we've given so much power over to the customer. And we always talk about the customer and what they want and what they need to be provided. And I mean, this happens inside of my company a lot. And I often bring up the point that customers are excellent at telling you what their problems are today. They are terrible at telling you what they will need 3 years and forward. So listening, you want to, again, balance. You want to listen to the customer's needs because there's value there, and solving their problems is critical utmost. That's where the value is created for the customer. But they're also very short-sighted, and they don't really know how to talk about things that are beyond the issues of the day or the week or the month that they are grappling with. And I see that for this in this discussion of, well, these students are telling us they need more industry skills and we need to cut the humanities programs, and they're not enrolling in these as much, that the enrollment numbers are in science, technology, engineering, mathematics. They're not in these Arabic studies programs. So let's get rid of Arabic studies. Well, I mean, in a pre 9/11 world, having a low enrollment number in your Arabic studies program, sure, cut that. But now we live in a post 9/11 world where that is an extremely valuable program. And how are you going to put that back in? So you don't really know what's going to happen in the future. And if you make these kinds of decisions just based off of where we are now and today, these are the kinds of situations that you end up with, in which an Arabic studies program would be, this is very valuable for where the United States discussions have been for the past, 14 plus years. So very important conversation. Okay, enough on that. Building a portfolio you can sell, I totally agree. That is now becoming a bigger part of what higher education is offering and doing. And I see that through, especially in the people that I follow in higher education, and helping the students get set up with GitHub and learning programming languages and putting some of their materials out for the world to be able to see. That is building a portfolio that will sell. And that's fantastic. We need that. I mean, it amazes me, back to the resume thing, that looking at, there are no links provided in many of these resumes that I've reviewed for where code that people have written is actually viewable from the outside world. So that's fantastic. I think we're all moving in that kind of direction. Okay, so the university and the whole of life, and colleges, this is a direct quote, colleges tell students they are getting training for life, but we didn't have any way we could verify or quantify that. And that is my university as a map metaphor that I've also used to talk about higher education. And that is the map of the past, the present, and the journey that the student is on towards the whole of their life. And by taking this time while in the university to really forge their identity completely. Okay, not just forging their skills, but creating uh, critical thinking citizens and other moral citizens. And this is all tied together with what Seneca is saying. And I think what the goal of higher education will, we need to have an honest discussion that this has to be valued just as much as the skills, the emphasis on the skills are being valued. And um, yeah, not much more to say on that. Okay, so the college degree as validation of these competencies and industry credentials, I mean, that's really where the clash is. Employers want to use these credentials to orient the employer to the applicant and look at um, and ensure that they have hired a person with the critical thinking, drive, brilliance. And this is Alan's point, is that these many credentials, these many qualifications allow employers to not take as much of a risk on hiring the big expensive genius who's graduated from Cornell or Harvard or the Ivy League system, because many credentials and having these skills, probably will suit the needs of most employers. And so there's this whole, hiring a someone who's got a PhD or a master's to bring them into, and I'm talking about fresh graduates here. I'm not talking about somebody who has this and then has worked in the technology field for 20 years. I'm talking about someone who's graduated with these credentials and then is moving into technology. Do we take a chance on that? Do we hire someone who is, no question, achieved within a level of others at a very high performance school, a very elite program? They have proven track record of success. Is that enough that we take a gamble on whether they can do information technology work? Or should we hire someone who doesn't have those credentials, but they have worked in technology since 1995 and they never went to college, but they have a very consistent and stable track record of working with technology companies and actually being able to deliver some results? I mean, if you have those kinds of things comparatively, which one are you going to choose? And that's where for both candidates, I see the credentialing system being something that will help enhance that whole decision making experience. But by having those credentials and being able to look at that, um, that's something that can only help. So we have a pathway that has been illuminated through outside of higher ed. Now it's our choice how far we'd like to go down that path, who's really in charge of it, what sort of matters and what doesn't, and we have to use our judgment to discern what those kinds of questions. There's not going to be an easy answer to what we do there. So I raised some questions, um, but um, I think this has probably been quite long enough, and so I'm just. Oh no, I do want to talk about um, college, higher education, sort of taking a couple of punches, and that is the negative news that's really been hitting universities over the last 2 years, 2 or 3 years, and the campus sexual assault, the uh, using students as confidential informants, which was the whole 60 Minutes program just a week ago, the institutionalization inside of higher ed of rather extreme policies around political correctness, safe spaces, speech codes, microaggressions, trigger warnings, etc. Faculty members are very frustrated with this. The complaint system, back to the whole consumers really driving what's happening, and the fact that we continue to lower the bar of what students should be able to tolerate while on campus, and we keep saying, well, it's got to be less and less and less, not that this is how we talk about things and this is what goes on. And there were even some articles written this year around comedians who are struggling to do their material on college campuses because this offensive, what people are taking umbrage to is pretty much everything at this point. So this is again one of the death of a thousand cuts. I mean, there's multiple punches being thrown. The student loan debt. Oh, man, this is a huge, huge issue. Collegiate sports. I mean, the fact that this is another massive piston that helps operate college campuses in which the benefit to those who participate is relatively low. And I mean, there are different sources on this around the college graduation rate, even of those who get sports scholarships, is actually around like 68%. I think I saw from Ohio State University. I mean, it's like near half. So this is another issue of, well, the university is making money, the vendors are making money, the parking attendants are making money, but the athletes aren't making any money. And this is, I mean, is that acceptable? We got to have a conversation around that. So that's another punch. Institutional financials. I've been following what's happened with Yeshiva University, who was ripped off by Bernie Madoff, and they've had to sell off some of their faculty buildings, some of their campus buildings to sort of make up for the debt. I mean, whether or not the financial stability of where the students are enrolled and how safe the financials, how safe they are over the long term. And then the respect of the institutions. I mean, I didn't even get into the sports scandals and other things that have sort of tarnished institutional respect. But that's another thing that's also kind of outside of the enrollees' control. But then if you're going to put your college on a resume, there might be some kind of scandal that's gone on there that hurts the respect of that. So higher education is definitely taking some punches, and it's going to be interesting to see how well it absorbs those and can punch back. So I lost my train of thought. I can't remember. Anyway, I I really hope you've enjoyed what I've tried to do here. Leave me any comments, and thanks for listening, and I look forward to your opinions as well. Bye for now.